fine. We'll just give it a couple of minutes.
Sure. I really should think about my background more thoroughly for the future. You know, when you see talking heads on television, it's always a bookcase, isn't it? You know, there's always a.
Can get the artificial ones. I haven't tried them yet, but I've seen some terrible ones.
Oh right, artificial ones, fantastic.
It's been, I don't know how to do it, but I think you can choose a background, and you can have really like space or I don't know, really weird.
Right. Oh,
they do look a bit strange. Are you staying busy, Kay?
Yeah, always busy. much like you, Jill.
Yeah. The thing is, you can never just sit back and think, oh, you know, there isn't a lot going on. It's always.
No, I don't know about you. It's exploded in case management and the medico-legal world. There's just so much work on at the moment.
I know.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Is it just because we had a long break over Christmas and then the COVID thing?
What, case management or medico-legal staff?
Case management.
I think part of it is, sorry, Jill, I think part of it is court timetables as well, and our part in gathering the evidence and the background for the medico-legal process.
Yeah. And
solicitors now having really squeezed timetables, and therefore the pressures on case management to get things done so it can be reviewed in the litigation sphere.
Yeah, you could well be right, but it's I think January historically is usually quite busy. It's full on because I think so many people are off. You know, I think just before Christmas, everybody's on this mad rush to get everything done and get their desk tidied, and then but it's all there when you come back. It's just like, busy.
It's just got added to in the Christmas break.
It has, I know. It's almost not worth having the holiday.
Absolutely.
I know.
And you've been busy, Paul.
Yeah, increasingly so. I've had a few new referrals come in the time that I've been here, all since the first week of January, to be fair. So, yeah, things are starting to move quite quickly, really.
Yeah,
I think you've moved to the right area, Paul. It's it's definitely a busy area for us.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course it helps. Knowing people here already. It's that's been a big kind of hit the ground running type situation. It's been it's been great. It's definitely the best move I've made. I've lived all over the country now, and this is definitely the best move I've made so far.
That's good. That's really good.
Good.
Do you want to get started? It's 5:05, so we can get started. And Gabby, if you can just let people in as they arrive, the latecomers. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jill Fraser. I'm the clinical lead at Maia Rehabilitation. So every month we're running a different training course with different speakers about relevant issues for case management and personal injury. Some of those, I was just saying to Paul, some of those training sessions will be open to clients and their families as well, as part of our inclusion policy and transparency, and just sharing interesting and necessary information such as the one we have today. We just for those of you who don't know, we at Maia, we are case management, but we have a a strong core team of rehab assistants who we provide training, and that is why we did this training every month, provided training for our rehab assistants. And then we thought, well, we don't need to keep it to ourselves, we can share it. So we share it with anyone that's interested, because it will benefit other people's clients too. But if ever you are looking for rehab assistance for your clients, for your teams, do let us know, because we've got pretty good in recruiting and training up our support staff to be rehab assistants. So we're very proud of that. So do let us know if you need any. I'm going to go on to now introduce you to Paul. So Paul is somebody that we've had a long-standing working relationship with. He is a doctor of psychology and a doctor of philosophy as well, although he says that's not relevant, but it is. And he has 17 years experience working with brain-injured clients. He has, you may have just picked up, he's recently moved to Bury St Edmunds, but he covers a wide range of the country. And he is often I've personally been doing it for about 20 years. And Paul is somebody I would always go to when possible, because the clients that I work with and Paul works with, the feedback's always been so positive. And I've seen that his approach is wonderful with the clients and their families. And also, he's a great team worker. So obviously, I'm a big fan of his. So I would like to hand over this training course to Paul. And after he's finished, there'll be a chance for Q&A. So Paul, all yours.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much for that very kind introduction. This is an unusual thing for me. I haven't given a presentation for a while now. So this morning, it obviously is all about fatigue, whether it's a symptom or a cause. And that question is very much for you guys, as much as it is for me. I'm not used to speaking to silent rooms of people. So I'd very much like this to be as discursive as possible, really. And if I say anything which isn't, well understood or well explained, please ask me to clarify, because that's a fault of mine if that has happened. So without further ado, we'll get into fatigue. Now, my approach to this presentation has been to try to make it fairly self-explanatory in terms of each slide, so that there's a sense of flow, and also that over the course of it, that it adds up to something useful, something clinically useful. And for me, usefulness always begins with having a clear view. My client's understanding of anything is very much about my understanding of things and then being able to communicate that effectively. So having a grasp, a particular grasp of any subject, I see as fundamental to my practice. And in terms of fatigue, it's very, very difficult to understand fatigue at all until we understand attention. Attention, I think, is probably the most fundamental thing that gets fatigued. It's where fatigue first happens. And I'm just going to read through the slide briefly, as I'm sure that the rest of you are as well. We know that the majority of people with a brain injury experience fatigue. I've seen estimates. I think the lowest estimate I've seen is about 70%. The highest estimate I've seen is over 90%. So fatigue is absolutely ubiquitous when it comes to brain injury. And a brain injury is essentially a breakdown in the connectivity of an energetic system. Our brains are very much input-output devices. It's about the energies of the world, the energies of our actions, and the brain there is a big mediating organ. And when the brain is injured, of course, the connections within that organ are altered, changed, never for the better, and that results in changes to the way that that organ functions, the way that it passes information around, information and energy. Now, attention, I view as the discriminated directing of that energy. Attention is always about something, and this is probably the hardest idea in the whole presentation, because it's not entirely intuitive. We often think of attention as this kind of something we do about things, and we separate it in our mind that there's this attention thing and then there's the things that we're attending to. But when it comes to information inside our heads, the attention and the object are actually much more closely fused. The attention is the aboutness. It's about the object itself, that mental object. Now, like I say, that's not an intuitive idea, and it's very, very difficult to get our heads around, partly because of grammar and experience. We so often think about attention and effort. Oh, what's that buzzing? Is that me? No. Attention and effort, and we tend to put these things in different camps, sometimes usefully, sometimes less so. But attention and effort are different. Attention performs a discriminative function based on really, really basic rules like similarity. And it is largely an unconscious process. It's not something we have full conscious control of. It's an implicit and automatic feature of brains. And that's a really, really important point, that attention is a property of a brain. And we have, as people, we have some conscious control over it, but that conscious control is not complete at all, not even in a healthy, uninjured brain. Brain injury, of course, reduces the automatic nature of attention at really, really fundamental levels. Very, very difficult to think about, very, very difficult to explain. But of course, if you change attention, if you damage that attentional, that fundamental attentional process, all of the other processes which are built on attention, of course, then suffer. And some of the earliest ones that we know about are working memory, processing speed, processing accuracy. We know that they're heavily related to a person's ability to attend, and that fundamental attentional process. But from this slide, what I really want people to take away is that attention is a property of brains, and that attention and effort are different. Does that make sense? It's not an easy set of ideas. I wouldn't be surprised if some people felt some confusion around that. It's not intuitive. I certainly struggled with those ideas when I first encountered them. But I'm happy to answer questions and engage in lively philosophical debate. Okay, so attention gets fatigued because brains are damaged. Now, something else that gets fatigued is motivation. This is the part that's associated with effort, and more to do with conscious control as well. Effort is what people do. Attention is what brains do. Effort is what people do. And effort is a personal and meaningful motivation, desires, concerns, goals, things we want, and that things we feel an appetite to strive for. Oh, I've got submarine noises.
I think it's it's all right, Paul. I think it's just if somebody turns their microphone on, but I think they.
Right, grand. Now, effectiveness, when we are, operating, acting effectively, it requires that effort and attention are working together. So, we're able to guide our attention, put it in the right place towards the right goal, and make those things happen. But they are different. Attention and effort are very, very different parts of this process. And striving or making an effort is not the same as attending. And this is why you can really, really want something, but that is not making it happen. Those two parts of the jigsaw they're very closely associated, but they are different, and that relationship can break down or become weaker, which is why we can try as hard as we like, but if we can't attend in a functional way and get those things working together effectively, then we won't make those desired goals, those personal and meaningful goals happen. Attention is easily overwhelmed and difficult to re-establish. Now that's true for all of us, depending on our situation. Of course, when the demands of our environment, the demands of our situation, they can overwhelm our ability to attend in effective ways. We just can't keep track. We just can't keep up. And when our attention is lost, we, without an injured brain, will find ways, using all of the other skills based on attention to actually redirect and refocus. But in a brain injured person, of course, that fundamental attentional process has been damaged and disrupted. So actually regaining focus, using attention to regain attention, is actually, very, very difficult. And because it is, already taxed and challenged because of brain injury, it's far more easy to overwhelm it. So even things which, that person may have considered fairly basic prior to their brain injury, now completely swamps their attention, and it's easy for them to lose focus.
Paul, can I ask a question at this point?
Go ahead.
So abulia.
Oh yeah.
So there is often a conflict between whether somebody has low motivation or is abulic. Can you go some way to explain how people here could possibly recognise the difference?
Well, abulia.
Sorry, I don't know that word, abulic. Can you just explain? Sorry about that.
Oh, sure. Abulia is commonly conceived of as a problem with initiating activity. And so it presents as somebody who really doesn't want to do too much, and they have very low rates of activity. Even previously enjoyed activities, leisure activities, people, someone who's described as abulic would be someone with very low motivation for anything, however pleasurable they used to find it. Now, I mean, it's the literature around abulia is slightly different to that around more general fatigue as is associated with brain injury. And there's the postulation that there are slightly different neural circuits involved. But it's certainly the case that in someone who is truly abulic, the lack of initiation, the low levels of motivation to engage in activity, they're not something that person is choosing. They are something that person is being subject to due to changes in the structure of the brain.
sorry there. So is abulia brain damage related, or can it be anything in life, age related, anything else, or is it always brain damage related?
Sure. I think it's pretty much always related to changes in neural structure. And it's interesting that you separated age-related and brain damage or brain injury, because of course we know that in later years we do see a far greater prevalence of changes to neural structure, changes to brain structure, associated with just normal aging, as well as any kind of disease process. So yeah, it could be a feature. Certainly there are some things I'm thinking of where that would be a strong feature, particularly as kind of certain disease entities progress. Yeah, sorry, is that answered your question, Jill, or did I go off topic there?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That did answer my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, there's certainly no. Well, we're going to come on to this later, but in abulia is not laziness. Absolutely not. You know. Right. Where was I up to? Oh yeah, striving, not making things happen. Yeah. Okay. So effort becomes frustrated if your attention just simply won't work in line with the things that you're striving for. Those efforts, they don't disappear, they just become really frustrated. You know, it's just not working, that sense that it's just not working. Now that's a deeply unrewarding experience. You know, sort of like there are these things that I want to happen, and it could be simple things. You know, there's this conversation I want to have, there's this you know, lunch that I want to put together. You know, really quite fundamental tasks of everyday activity, and they become deeply unrewarding because it's just so frustrating. There are things that you want, your attention just will not allow you to do those things effectively, and so motivation can become reduced because it is deeply unrewarding. And this seems to be borne out by the studies on the neurochemistry and the different neural pathways that are actually involved in a lot of these processes. The caudate nucleus, which is very much about reward and sensing reward and how that's then passed on to the rest of the brain and communicated to the rest of the brain. Also the striatum, which is about our internal state. Again, it's part of the reward network. These are very deep structures in the brain, and they're all part of something else called the ascending reticulated activation pathway, and it mapped onto what we know about fatigue and how fatigue and motivation co-vary, work together or not, as the case might be. The last point on this slide that I've made is that the person with a frustrated sense of effort and attention not working together, they will experience cognitive fatigue, and I'm sure that's a term that many of you have heard before. The cognitive fatigue is actually part of the brain. You know, that's a property of a brain that's just not able to do those fundamental things easily. And tiredness is what the person experiences. They will actually feel tired. And I've put in brackets there iceberg, and I'm hoping people will be thinking, why on earth has he written iceberg there? And because it's very much like an iceberg. If we rely on people's, you know, our clients' kind of statements about tiredness, their descriptions and experience of tiredness, by the time they're experiencing tiredness, their cognitive fatigue has really taken root. So it is very much the tip of the iceberg. We have to be making assessments of fatigue by looking at a far broader range of things rather than just the person's statements of, oh, I feel exhausted now, because that's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Just a quick question, Paul. Sorry, is that what sometimes people could maybe misconstrue as or describe as brain fog? So when everyone gets a bit ill, and I think that's usually the first thing to go, isn't it? You get a bit, you can't think, and that's sort of, well, I suppose the tip of the iceberg. But is
Absolutely.
that the same?
Yeah, it's very, very, very highly related, and of course, it's been in the news a great deal recently, isn't it, with post-COVID syndrome? Lots and lots of people who have suffered a COVID infection have had quite long periods afterwards where they experience brain fog. And that is, well, research is ongoing, but it does look like there are some neurochemical changes to the brain caused by this virus and the body's response to it. It's an effect upon that fundamental attentional process. That attentional property of the brain has been affected. And of course, we experience it as people as having this foggy brain. Nothing seems clear, nothing seems easy. I think that's the brain fog you're talking about. Okie doke. Right. The neuropsychological presentation. I've split this up to try and make it clearer. So I've started with the neuropsychological presentation. What follows is going to be the personal presentation and then something else as well about how this presents. When attentional processes and working memory, which is founded on attentional processes, when they're overwhelmed, the neuropsychological presentation is something that we would call dysexecutive. That's what we see. We see problems in people using executive skills. And some of those are listed below. Effort and energy in the system is easily misplaced, a bit like losing focus, very difficult to re-establish. But the effort and the energy easily become misplaced, and objects, internal objects, representations of information, things like ideas, things like feelings, are very, very poorly discriminated. They no longer have sharp outlines. They're not things that we can grasp easily. And again, this goes back to your point, Gabby, about brain fog. Things just don't seem clear. People will experience and show reduced flexibility in their thinking. They won't be able to incorporate new ideas. They won't be able to take on a new piece of information and think about the whole thing again. So they will come across as a little bit rigid in their thinking. And part of this is a very rewarding solution for people. People broadly, as well as our brain injured clients, in that you can come, you develop a very simple rule. This should happen, and then you apply it everywhere, regardless of any change in circumstance or new information. And that reduced flexibility or rigidity is something that we'll see happening quite quickly as that attentional process is overwhelmed. Another expression of the same rigidity is the perseveration, getting stuck on a particular action, idea, way of doing something. Perseveration is just a really, really posh word for persevering. But it is something that we see, people over persevering. Now, of course, over persevering can be great, but you have to have the flexibility. If you don't have the flexibility, then over persevering can look like obsession or being stuck. You simply, can't get away from a particular routine. Rather, it would seem paradoxically, we also find people not only being rigid, but also having some impulsive cognition. So the way that they treat that information, they might only have a simple rule, a very rigid rule, but then they might flip into a different rule and get stuck on that because they can only handle one rule or two rules at a time because they don't have that flexibility. So it can look a bit random sometimes. People will be perhaps talking about one thing and then talking about something completely different. And we're often left, wondering, how did they get from there to there? It just can't, what happened there? And what actually happened there was that someone was taking one simple rule and swapping it for another simple rule without any kind of flexibility or weighing and consideration in between. Because of all of these things, we do tend to see people being unable to sequence their thoughts. The simple act of sitting there and listening to this presentation, you are sequencing thoughts like you would never believe. You're putting things in order and arranging them very much hierarchically, so that you have a better sense. You're trying to make sense of things. And that, again, it's all founded on attention. And if that attention is overwhelmed, that sequencing becomes incredibly difficult. People simply can't, they might be able to sequence one idea, two ideas, and then the first idea is lost. And so they can very, very quickly find themselves not keeping up. I think that's the thing I hear most from clients. I just can't keep up. And Shani, I know that you have a very thorough experience of this with one of our mutual clients. And it is, again, it's about that working memory, the attentional process being overwhelmed. Okay, now that's the neuropsychological, that's how the brain presents. This is the personal presentation. This is how the person presents. So they will experience a loss of focus. And I'm going to add brain fog in here as well, Gabby. They will definitely experience brain fog. They will experience task disruption. So the tasks they're engaged in or that their situation requires of them, they'll find it very, very difficult to complete them without giving themselves some serious self-talk or having the support of somebody else to help keep that person on task. They will feel confused and disoriented. They will feel a bit lost quite a lot of the time, depending on the depth of that attentional loss. But confusion and disorientation can go all the way up to not knowing where you are, what time of day it is, why you're where you are. Those kinds of very, disoriented to time and place. Very, very serious. And we see that in a lot of presentations, not just traumatic brain injury. I think one of the best real world examples of that is when people get lost. They go out of the house, they have their keys in their hand, they go into town, get a coffee, and they don't know where they live. They're just completely disoriented. And that is an attentional, fundamentally attentional based process. People with difficulties in these areas, they won't consider outcomes and consequences in the same way, because that's a very sophisticated piece of thinking that requires a lot of attention, and it's much more difficult for them to do. So you can imagine there are some issues of risk come up when those things are more difficult for the person to do. They'll do things, and we'll know when we hear about it or when we see it happening that whoa, it shouldn't be let's stop and think about that. And we have to be able to say that to them, because they will not do that automatically for themselves. They will have difficulty with planning and organising. Again, very sophisticated sequencing involved in planning and organising. And it all begins with that attentional process. New information is only poorly integrated. So you can ask someone to consider a new piece of information, ask them to consider your point of view, and it's very difficult for that person to take that on board. It's just too much information. They can't attend to it all at once. As a consequence of all of these things, the world can lose value. Now, I know that probably seems a bit dramatic, but if everything's confusing, nothing's working out, everything takes a massive effort, all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a slump. There's a real slump for the person. And that is literally what is reduced enjoyment. When the world loses value. Without an injured brain, we hear people say things like, I'm bored. I very famously say to people, I don't believe in boredom. I believe in fatigue, but I don't believe in boredom. But it is very much reduced enjoyment. And this is, I'm sure, reduced enjoyment might echo, sort of like in your minds, because it's a big feature of low mood and depression. If you can't enjoy things, then obviously your mood is going to go down. But it's founded in fatigue of that attentional process. There's a client of mine that some of you will know, and she described this fatigue process as absolutely precipitous. She said, I can be fine, and then I'm gone. And when it happens, she doesn't know it's creeping up on her, and it happens instantaneously. And one of the big signs to her, well, there was a couple of big signs that she really notices. One of them is mood. She stops enjoying anything. And the other is her posture, actually. But that's quite specific to her particular injury. But that completely frustrated sense of effort, it's gone. And there's no enjoyment there. Now, the cognitive behavioural presentation, I've put this in here because this is where, fatigue, okay, so fatigue is caused by, or certainly predisposed by the challenged brain, the injured brain, because it just doesn't have the resources that it used to have. And then as a consequence to that, the fatigue actually causes changes for the person. And we spoke about some of those in the personal presentation. In the cognitive behavioural presentation, these are some of the other things that we will see. Remember, fatigue of that attentional process is a repeated experience, not just once a week, but probably once an hour. So it becomes a feature of a person's life, and they will become very anxious. They'll become very anxious about things because it's very difficult to keep up. You feel disoriented. You don't know what's coming next, and you're going to have a terrible worry about going into situations where you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So you will always feel anxious. Along with anxious preoccupations comes stress. That's a very physical thing. The adrenal glands fire up and pump us full of cortisol and adrenergic hormones, and that's another reversive experience. It's literally the chemistry of fear. So it's horrible, and that can go all the way to making people sick, panicky, weak. And in itself, it's absolutely exhausting to feel anxious and stressed. They will have frustrated affect. They're going to be, pardon my French, frankly quite pissed off that things just don't work out. Everything's so hard. They will start to develop negative self-appraisals. I'm broken, I'm useless, I can't do stuff. And they will start to see that as an aspect of themselves you know, unless obviously we step in and help them manage that, and they will start to see themselves as less valuable, less effective. Quite naturally, you will see lowered mood come along with fatigue. You know, there's already a loss of enjoyment that we spoke about earlier. And here we've got someone thinking negatively about the world, not enjoying it, thinking negatively about themselves and their abilities, feeling anxious and stressed all of the time. It's not a happy picture at all. And so, you know, these things will come along with poorly managed continuous experiences of fatigue. When people are anxious, what makes them anxious, they will avoid. So, you know, it's not just, oh, I'm really worried about going out into that world where unknown things could happen, unexpected things could happen. I don't know how I'll handle them. And they'll start to, well, I don't want to do those things. So you will see some avoidance, and that can translate as a social withdrawal. And, you know, they want to do the things that make them most anxious, they want to do less. That could be socializing, could be going to supermarkets, could be a whole variety of things where the processing demands are really high. And that is something that we would call reduced initiation. They're not going to come up with the idea to do those things because they just know that they're so taxing. They're just so difficult for them and anxiety provoking, they don't want to do them. All of that, of course, then causes further problems to the attentional process. You're so swamped by your internal experience of that fatigue and its impacts that it actually produces a further effect. And so we end up seeing people spiraling down. They will fatigue, feel quite grim, both personally and in a cognitive behavioral way. And then their abilities will be further reduced. And so there's this accelerating cycle where people begin with a little bit of fatigue as they're becoming overwhelmed. They'll cycle through possibly some or all of these, hopefully not too severely, but they will cycle through these, and then their attentional processes are further challenged. And so it just seems to spiral down and down and down and down. Very, very difficult for people. Right, assessing for fatigue. I used to many years ago. I remember when I was a fairly junior psychologist, asking people whether they got fatigued. I now realise in the wisdom of my latter years that that's probably, you know, the most ridiculous question. It's, you know, it's nonsensical. You know, it's not a question of whether a person becomes cognitively fatigued, but it's when and how and doing what when they become fatigued. It's an absolute given that someone with a brain injury is going to have an easily overwhelmed attentional process. They are going to experience fatigue. Excuse me. I think that's probably reflected in the ubiquitousness of fatigue for brain injured people. You know, rates of 90%, you know, plus. We know that a brain injury affects some pretty fundamental processes because anyone with a brain injury seems to be affected by it. My question is whether the other 10%, you know, I wonder what's going on there, but they don't have, you know, don't appear to be experiencing any fatigue. Thresholds when we're assessing fatigue is something important to consider. Where do we set the bar for fatigue? And a couple of the really quite widely used kind of short questionnaires, short scales that people use for assessing fatigue are the Fatigue Severity Scale and the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. Now, the Epworth Sleepiness Scale is about how often you find yourself, your eyes closing and you're falling asleep. mid-task, whether that task is watching something on television or sitting in the passenger seat of a car. But as we discussed earlier, sleepiness is really just the tip of the iceberg. That's setting the bar very high. It's essentially saying, well, if you're not falling asleep, you're not experiencing fatigue. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think people are presenting as fatigued and with all of the difficulties associated with fatigue long time before their eyes are closing. The fatigue severity scale is a bit better. Its focus is slightly different. It tends to look at the impact of fatigue upon a person's life and relationships, importantly. And so for me, that has a greater validity. But if we restrict our assessment to those results, we're going to be missing the true depth and the origins of fatigue. It's really about that attentional process. Well, I would always look for the presence of anxiety, avoidance of activities, poor enjoyment and negative self-appraisals, because I know they come along with fatigue. So where those things are present, I know that there's a fatigue management issue to work on, or very likely a fatigue management issue, certainly in the context of brain injury. All of these people, they might have a brain injury in common, but they're all extremely different. Individuals have different motivations, concerns, interests, histories, the things that they are effortful about, the things that they strive for. And so our assessment always has to be of this person's fatigue at these times and in this context. Has to be very individual, very specific. There is no one size fits all, because people are just so different. Their brains might have some common features, but people are very different. And so it has to be individual, and it has to be dynamic. And by dynamic in this context, I just mean sensitive to time, time and situation. Managing fatigue, and this is the second to last slide, and you'll enjoy the last slide. Managing fatigue, finding a better fit between the person's attentional resources and the demands of their environment or the tasks that they're engaged with. So it's trying to help their efforts and their attention work better together to produce more effective outcomes. Now, because of that person's difficulties, they can't, the fact they're getting fatigued, the fact it's all about attention, they do not have the resources to organise and plan for themselves and, start their own fatigue management. When we first meet our clients, what we'll find is that they're just doing, sleep, doing, sleep. And it's this boom and bust approach to their self-management of fatigue, when in fact we can put their organising and planning functions in place for them to a certain extent, and we can approximate those executive functions which they would normally use to do this but are now so challenged that they can't. Pacing and prioritising has to be personalised, has to be individualised, that can be finding the right kind of rest for that person at that time. It's not always necessarily sleep, and in fact sleep should be the last resort. Education and motivation for using those structures, that's a big part of the rehab around fatigue management. And slowly over the course of time, promotion of self-management. So we model those things, we give people an understanding of them, and then we try to get them to actually take them on board and start using them for themselves. This is all really important for the brain injured person, of course, but critically also for the people that they're close to, for the important others. There has to be an environment which accommodates the need for these structures to be in place. If someone has a partner who says, oh yeah, since their brain injury, they're just really lazy, it hacks me off. That lack of understanding is deeply damaging. to the whole attempt to manage things, and of course emotionally to the person with a brain injury. Again, the unhelpful attributions, this attribution of laziness. Oh, just make more effort. Just make more effort. It's you can try as hard as you like. It's not going to improve my attentional resources. And that must be very, very frustrating. Probably results in a lot of conflict in relationships. Medication, very mixed evidence at the current time. Very kind of like junior studies. I know that modafinil and methylphenidate have been used. I've actually had clients, or a client that was prescribed one of those with mixed results. And the evidence seems to reflect that across the board. So very tricky. I don't think there's a standard prescription for that in traumatic brain injury, acquired brain injury at the moment. And then, of course, you have to include specific interventions for the self-management of stress, anxiety, worrying thoughts, attributions which are negative about the person themselves. And because unless we can help them better manage their stress, that spiraling down will always happen when they get anxious. So it's an inherent part of managing fatigue, is helping a person manage their own internal mood and arousal. So, is fatigue a symptom or a cause? That is for you to decide. That was sneaky of me, wasn't it? No easy answers there, And that is very much the end of it.
That's a double-ended question there, Paul. It's both, surely.
Yeah, absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely both. And it's not even easy to put them on the same line. It's so cyclical that it could really only be both. Yeah, in my view. I'm happy to hear other views.
Well, that was fascinating, actually. I think so many of us work with this all the time, but you can never really know it all, can you? No. And like you said, everybody is so different. All our clients are so different because of their personalities and their environments and their extended families, etc. And we have to take that in context. And it's, I think, especially most of us, are out there working on our own. So it's easy to forget some of the fundamentals of this. So that was really interesting. I'd almost forgotten that it comes back to attention.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Fundamentally grounded.
Yeah.
One of the questions I had for you, Paul, was when you were talking about reduced cognitive sequencing. I was wondering, is that easy to identify? Because I know, it could be quite a common symptom that a lot of clients are dealing with, and is it one of those that should be quite by the team around them, or is it quite a tricky one to see?
I don't think it's tricky to see. I think it's fairly clear from a person's ability to plan and organise and actually sequence their actions as well as their thoughts. The thinking part is what happens first. Oh, it's raining. I need to put my coat on before I go out the door. It can be that fundamental and basic, but those will be the signs that this person isn't making those considerations. They're not sequencing their actions. They're not planning and organising in their head, because what we do should follow how we've represented that information and then acted upon it. And obviously that whole system is challenged, overwhelmed, and breaks down. But it should be fairly easy to spot, fairly easy.
Thank you. So it's not the most subtle one then?
No. It can be subtle, but most of the time the indicators, you only have to see a few indicators of it and you think, right, okay, yeah, I know what's going on here. And then you can, once you've seen it, you'll see it everywhere.
I know that the majority of us are working with fatigue management, so we'll be familiar with the terms, pacing, rest and planning activities, so with the client, etc. And that is a particular piece of work for, it could be psychologists or OTs and the rehab assistants as well. And I know that's a challenge for all of us to work with that client. But I think you touched on it earlier, when you've got people that live with that client or are very important to that client that don't understand, I think it makes the job incredibly difficult, because we can be helping a client to understand and learn about their fatigue and look at the triggers and the points where they are able to recognise. But then if they have got an important other saying, oh, well, just ignore that, you can sleep next week, or whatever it is, and it makes it so difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a supportive relational environment is absolutely critical for these things. The situations in which I see people suffer most with fatigue is, you know, where they're starting to develop symptoms of pronounced anxiety and depression, particularly, are those situations that don't have a supportive relational environment. So the person doesn't feel that they can take the rest. They have to deny their fatigue for the sakes of appearing normal often, or not appearing lazy. So they just go on this boom and bust cycle. A client said to me recently, I feel, you know, if I take rest, I feel like I'm giving up. I said, no. I said, you're not giving up. You're just making the next thing you do better. And they immediately, oh, right, yeah, absolutely. So there was a positive appraisal for coping with that fatigue, and it immediately increased the chances of them taking that rest that they need.
So would you say that that it is probably vital to provide that education to all of those important people of the client?
I would say so. You know, but more so and critically so when you feel that the relational environment may not be the most supportive or entirely up to speed in terms of their understanding of this person's difficulties. In some situations that seems to happen. You know, it tends to be the rule rather than the exception that there's a lack of understanding. But there are some situations, they are the exception, not the rule, where that understanding is quickly developed and an acceptance is quickly developed. And that support seems to more naturally arise and spontaneously. And obviously it's lovely when you see that, but it's just not, it's not that frequent.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I have a comment there, Jill. That was really, really informative and educational. And just going on from what Jill was saying, if this recording was made available to partners and family of some of our clients, I think that would be so useful.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's really lovely to hear you. It's a very kind thing to say. The only thing that would concern me is that I often tailor, you know, when I'm actually providing this information to people who don't work in the field, particularly. I kind of tailor it, pare it down. I would probably simplify it much more and be very specific about the points I wanted to make, because I do worry a little that if someone had this, you know, I don't know how long I was talking for, but maybe about 50 minutes, how much of that they would take away and how useful that would be. I think that kind of individual approach is often what makes things more effective.
One of the things that we were talking about earlier with what we're planning to do with some of our training is to provide it to families, clients and families where it's appropriate. So maybe this presentation could be adapted, Paul.
Yeah.
And we can have a separate presentation for clients and families.
Absolutely.
Because we want to obviously include everybody, and yes, it would be pitched slightly differently.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great, and it would also actually give some of our clients and family members the chance to meet each other and swap notes effectively. And I think there's a good element of support that could come from a forum like that.
Paul and Jill, I think one of the other good points about that presentation for families and presentation for clients is the ability for them, if they've got a recorded version, to be able to go back and refer to it, so that then they're able to go through it again. Just the amount of repetitions it takes sometimes with some of our clients. They've got it as kind of a refer to guide.
Sure.
I think, Paul, we've certainly done that with one of the clients we've worked with, made some sort of go back to guides on different things to assist with that kind of cognitive and memory function and management of specific needs.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a really good guide, Kay. I know you'll have seen it. That the Headway guide to fatigue management, I think, is really, really good. I mean, it's I was quite surprised, actually. It's pitched at quite a high level in places. There's a kind of a good deal of neuroanatomical and kind of quite complex information there. But I thought it was excellent in the way that it actually presented the range of issues and strategies for management. I suspect there's probably an even simpler version that could be drawn from their pamphlet. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, I thought it was excellent.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end now. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you, Paul. It was fascinating. It was educational, and I hope you can do it again for us. Thank you to everybody that's come today. If you have any questions you want to ask Paul or me afterwards, then please just contact us if you want any more information as well. And as I said earlier, we're running these every month, so we'll send you links to the next presentation training we have, and if you're interested, it would be great to see you again. But hopefully you enjoyed that and found it helpful, and we'll let you know about the client and family inclusion ones as well. Hopefully we'll get a good turnout for that. So yeah, and please tell your colleagues about what we're doing as well, so they might be interested too.
I'll just make the point, if you want the recording of this, just let me know and I can send it to you.
Fantastic. I might have one, actually, if that's all right, Gabby. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.